Good evening. This is Donna from the LaSalle Public Library welcoming you to our virtual presentation of Dennis Stroughmatt doing Mussels, Moonshine, and Music. And we are pleased to offer this program tonight. This is a program funded by the Illinois Humanities Council, a state agency. The Illinois Humanities is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Illinois General Assembly through the Illinois Arts Council, a state agency, as well as by contributions from individuals, foundations, and corporations. There will be an IHC survey at the end. We would really appreciate everyone completing it and sending it back in. Also, you'll have an opportunity to ask Dennis questions at the end. Please put your questions in the chat box while the program is proceeding, and we will try to cover as many as possible at the end of the program. Dennis recorded his video of his presentation. However, he is here live with us tonight.
Hello.
There he is. So we will be starting by sharing Dennis's video in just a minute. First, I want to let the audience know about two upcoming programs. First one is a NASA program, August 4th, Women in Space. We did do this program earlier this year before the pandemic, and there were so many people who requested that we offer it again because it was missed. We will be having it in August at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Joel Napper is our presenter. He is our Solar System Ambassador. Our other program that we have coming up is author Gary Moore. He has written the book, Playing with the Enemy. Gary will be joining us to discuss his book. It is a biography of his father, Gene Moore. It's history and hope. It includes everything from a small downstate Illinois town to World War II, baseball, and German U-boat. So quite an interesting book. I'm sure you'll enjoy the program. And the book is available at the LaSalle Library in hardbound and in audio CD. And the LaSalle Public Library also offers through Omni the ebook and the e-audiobook, and the book is also available through interlibrary loan. And with that, we are going to get started. I'm going to share Dennis's screen and mute my microphone, and we'll be back after the program. Please don't hesitate to put your questions in the chat box. Thanks.
Stroughmatt, and I'm doing my program. This is called Mussel Shelling, Moonshine, and Music. This is for the Illinois Humanities Council Rhodes Scholars Program, and I'm here to talk about various different parts of essentially the history of migrant life in the latter part of the 1800s, the late 19th century, and the early 20th century. And in a lot of ways, this program is kind of biographical for me. It's much of it comes from my family. And if some of you, if you're watching this program, probably know that I do have another program that I do, which is on French Creole fiddle, tunes and tales, music, which also kind of has to do, not kind of, it does have to do with Southern Illinois and our area as well. It's probably the reason I have like creolefiddle.com behind me. That's just here. So pay no attention to that. But anyway, because I'm here to play, that first song I played was actually a song called Boil Them Cabbage Down, which is just an old fiddle tune that was played in my family many, many years ago. Now, my family, like hundreds of, if not thousands, well, definitely thousands of families in the latter part of the 1800s, essentially became a nomadic, or you might say a migrant group of people, and there were a lot of different reasons for that. One of the reasons that many families in the latter part of the 1800s became nomadic was really kind of an after effect of the American Civil War in a lot of ways. A lot of families in Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, Southern Illinois was even somewhat involved in that, lost homes during the American Civil War, and this affected many families, caused a great deal of poverty essentially for decades after the American Civil War. And so some families had to find different ways to make a living, to live at all. And so they kind of created what you might call a gypsy lifestyle in some ways. Many of them, they worked on the rivers, or they used the rivers as their road, essentially, that the waterways was how they got around. And some of these main waterways were like the Wabash River in Southern Illinois, the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, the Tennessee River, the Cumberland River, the Missouri River. These were all rivers that were kind of a part of that, that were about essentially getting people from one place to another. And some of the businesses that they were involved in, like for my family, for instance, that were involved in, and these were people, my family, the Stroughmatt family, and I'm talking about my namesake, in the 1800s, essentially were migrants who lived on boats. They lived on houseboats. They did not own land. They were not landowners in the sense that they were farmers who had land that they were passing from generation to generation. But yet many of them were farmers, and what they did was one of the laboring things of labor that they did was some of them were sharecroppers. In some cases, they were carpenters. In other cases, they were musicians. And even later on, some of them were moonshiners, and I'll come back and talk about that in a little bit. But of course, you know, I'm holding a fiddle in my hand, and I talked about that song, Boil Them Cabbage Down, where there's a reason, and I'll come back for that, because people in my family were also musicians and used music. So we're talking heavily right now really about the latter part of the 1800s, and we're talking about, like I say, some of the after effects of the American Civil War. And, well, like I say, for many migrants, the agrarian economy was where they worked for the most part. Either they, you know, just to live hunting, you know, but to earn money, sharecropping, or working on farms, migrant working on farms. Not necessarily unlike a lot of the Hispanics who work in the migrant field today, working in produce and essentially the agricultural economy. This is what we had. My family is a legacy of that, and you might say I'm kind of a legacy of the whole idea of migrancy and moving around, because you know, musicians back then, they had to find ways to make money, and for some reason, somehow, I'm a musician with a master's degree in history who decided to use a fiddle at some point to make a little money, with an emphasis on little.
Vagabond.
Oh, by the way, I should mention that I'm doing this video in our basement, and my wife's sitting right next to the camera. And you also might hear some bumpity bump, and that would be my girls upstairs running around. We also might see some cats kind of running around here through here too. We have some cats. But
welcome to our home.
That's all right. Welcome to our home. So, but I want to start really on one of the first of the three major areas, and it's really kind of, I focus more on two major, but one of them is I love to just talk about. It's just kind of fun to talk about. But the first one is the mussel shelling industry. And this is a major industry, or was a major industry for migrant workers in the Midwest and the Upper South in the latter part of the 1800s, and actually pretty much all the way until World War II. And my family was very much involved in that. Like I said, my family, the Stroughmatt family, these were river people. A lot of people used the term when I was growing up. For my family that was in White County in Grayville, Illinois, they called them river rats, you know, and many generations of them. My grandfather, who was born around 1904, was actually born on a houseboat in White County, Illinois, on the Little Wabash River.
Poor Grandma.
I know, just like many people in you know, and hundreds, if not thousands. In fact, I don't have a photo. I wish I had a life-size photo that you can actually look this up. A good example of to see what migrancy was like in the latter part of the 1800s and early 1900s. You can take a look at pictures of Cairo, Illinois. We say Cairo, Illinois. Some people call it Cairo. Well, that it's only if you're from central and northern Illinois. Maybe you might call that. My wife's frowning at me. She's from northern Illinois. So anyway, but no, we say Cairo, and actually in the latter part of the 1800s, early 1900s, there are photos that exist of hundreds, if not thousands, of boats docked and tied up to each other along the Ohio River. Now, not really so much the Mississippi River. Now, you say the Ohio and the Mississippi, for a little geography lesson here, the Ohio and Mississippi converge at Cairo, Illinois. That's exactly where they converged. But it's pretty much really kind of on the Ohio side where a lot of the boats would dock and tie up to each other, and essentially creating almost like this floating city in a lot of ways. There were more people who actually lived on houseboats, migrant workers who lived on houseboats, than there were people who actually lived in the city of Cairo itself. And so there are examples of photos of that. And it was a good spot because you could see that from Cairo you could go many rivers. You could the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, get to the Arkansas River, the Wolf River in Tennessee, the Missouri River, up to the Wabash River, the Little Wabash, the White River in Indiana. So from there you could fan out to many different areas. And my grandfather told me that they worked many of those rivers. And for many people, what changed their lives financially was because of one man who was an inventor, kind of a jeweler, you might say, by the name of Johann Boppel, a German jeweler, who in the 1870s, 1880s, in his industry in Germany, actually used bone. He used wood, but he also used shells to cut buttons. And you can see the outline of a button here on this shell. Now, this is a freshwater mussel shell. And here's an example of blanks cut out of a mussel shell. But he didn't use freshwater shells originally. In the 1870s and 80s, he would have used Pacific oysters. This is what he actually was using and importing into Germany, but by the 1880s, started having problems importing oysters into Germany, into Europe. And by happenstance, the story is that he got a hold of a few freshwater shells that came from the United States, would have come from the Midwest somewhere. And he remarked on essentially the thickness of the shells that came from the United States and how good these shells were and how productive they would be and how many buttons or blanks a person could actually get out of one of those shells. So when he realized that if he wanted to continue in this business and he thought that there was a good idea, he had a good idea that he could really turn a profit in the button business, he immigrated to the United States. Now, how he ends up finding the mussel shells is the story is that his sister lived in central Illinois and near the Sangamon River near Springfield, and that he just happened to be wading out in the river. Now, this is a myth. We don't know if it's absolutely true, but that he was apparently wading in on a sandbar somewhere along the Saginaw River and cut his toe on a mussel shell. And the mussel shells themselves, when they're usually laying in a river, they're not going to be laying like this. They're not closed in a river. They don't sit like this. If you go into a sandbar on a river, you're going to see mussel shells sitting open like this. When I was a child, my grandfather took me out on sandbars on the Wabash River in Grayville, Illinois, which is where he had been involved in the mussel shelling industry. And I saw mussel shells sitting open like this. You would see them floating around like this in the river. Well, apparently Johann Boppel cut his toe on one. Well, realizing he had found the shells, he had brought his machinery or some of his ideas with him from Germany to create a button cutting machine. But it was a button cutting machine that essentially was hand driven or foot driven or human driven. Not extremely efficient. He was not able to cut that many buttons. And not only that, at the time, he migrated in the late 1880s, and so this is the early 1890s. There was really no industry yet as far as an idea of actually how to dig for shells. Now, essentially, his industry, though, his idea of cutting buttons or cutting blanks is going to essentially create a feeder industry. Just much like you have in the automobile industry, you have to have people who will make different parts for cars that aren't at the car factory. And that's essentially what you have in the mussel shelling industry, is it creates another industry. And some people call that clamming. In my family, I never heard the term clamming, ever. I didn't even hear it until a few years ago. My grandparents and great uncles who were involved in the business always just called it mussel shelling, whether you were cutting buttons or you were digging shells. What's digging the shell? Okay, that's the feeder industry that I was talking about. So if you're going to cut buttons, you have to have the shells. How do you get the shells? Well, essentially a person could just dig them. You know, you could go to a sandbar and you could literally just pick them up out of the river, but that takes a long time. That takes a long time to do, and the effort is massive to do that. What happens is in the 1890s, someone creates a process of getting shells, essentially using long john boats. They will use long bars that they will call a crow's foot bar, and hanging down, essentially long ropes or chains, depending on what you're using, or wire. At the end of that will be hooks, essentially, that a person will take and actually can make and bend their own hooks, cut their own hooks. They're usually about this long, and then there's usually 5 to 6 hooks that sit underneath bars that hang down, and they're coming down, hang down anywhere from 10 to 15 feet. A bar could be as long as essentially as the john boat is. You drop those in the river and you drag them. You don't drag them with a boat with a motor running. My grandfather always told me that. He said you had to use something essentially was kind of like an upside down sail that was made of like cotton duck material, almost, or something like a burlap essentially, that they would put down into the water, almost like a sail essentially, or an oar. And they would use that to guide themselves along the river after they could shut off the engine. Because the engine, if you're doing that, after they've dropped this crowfoot bar onto the sandbars, if you start an engine, what happens? Boom. All of a sudden, the clams, the shells, they will close. But if you float, if you're floating over the sandbars and you run those crow's feet across them, as soon as the crow's feet hit the shell, it scares the mussel shell, closes on one of the hooks. And sometimes, depending on the sandbar, one set of crow's foot could pull in anywhere to 200 to 300 shells at a time, different sizes. And essentially, if the shells were too small, they would, after they brought the shells in, they would have to bring them, put them in the John boat, and they would go to the shore. If the shells were too small, they would take them back. It's interesting. They were smart enough to know at that point that if you used every size of shell, there would be no small ones to grow, and so they would actually take the small ones back. But the larger shell, usually the smallest shell you would see are actually some shells that I'm showing you, just like this, essentially like a maple leaf shell. There were several different names. They had names for shells like the ridgeback, three ridge, sand shell. This is like a three ridge right here. They also have one, for example, they called like a pistol grip. This is an example of a pistol grip. And why a pistol grip? Because you can sit there and hold it like this. It's like a pistol. My wife's looking at going, really? Yeah, actually, yeah. There are all different names for them. And my favorite was the pigtoe. Actually, there's a pigtoe. And we have one around here somewhere, but I don't know where it is. My grandfather had lots of shells. And growing up, because I'm going to talk about another part of the industry, but I'll just show you a picture really quickly that hopefully it will show up. My wife can let me know if you can see this on the camera. And essentially, that's just an example of one of the mounds of shells that was still existing.
Pardon my fingernail.
That was existing at my grandfather's house in the early 1970s. My brother and I, Doug, we used to play on those mounds of shells.
Ouch.
And yes, we would cut our feet. But anyway, back to the industry. So they dig the shells. This is important. What do you do with the shells? Well, essentially you have to get rid of the meat out of the shells. What they would do is they would boil the shells out. They would do this by digging long trenches in the ground, usually on the shore, and they would essentially, kind of like when people will barbecue a pig in ground, that's essentially what you would do with shells. You would kind of like smoke the meat out of the shells, get the meat out of the shells. They would not throw away the shell meat. They would not throw away the mussel shell meat. In this industry, you used everything. And so what they often would do is they would sell the discarded meat to pig farmers in the area, because pigs loved mussel shell meat. For those of you that are out there watching this, you're probably going, ew, yuck. Well, you could only say ew, yuck unless you were the pig on the other side eating it. Now, my grandfather, I did ask my grandfather one time about why didn't they just eat the mussel meat? You know, I mean, people eat oysters all the time. And he would just look at me and he said, yeah. He said, if you were absolutely starving, he said, you could take a look at the mussel shell meat. But at that point, what you might do is you might try to decide if you would rather eat the mussel shell meat or your shoe. Basically, what was better, the leather or mussel shell meat? And he said, I would probably prefer my own shoe over mussel shell meat because it was that bad. But anyway, so they get the shells, they bring the shells to shore, they get the meat out, they take the shells to button cutting factory. Not a button cutting finishing plant, but a button cutting factory. There were many different button cutting factories. This is an example of one. I don't know if you can see this very well, but this is one called the Elk Pearl Button Factory. And right here is my grandfather. Well, there again, it's too small for you to be able to see. My grandfather, Chancey Stroughmatt's in there. One of my great uncles, Othel Goldsmith, is in there too. And so, but this was in Grayville, Illinois at the Elk Pearl Button Factory. And another example is essentially that picture that you can't hardly see from here. My wife can show you This is the Elk Pearl Button Factory in the 1980s. I took a picture of the factory in the 1980s. And it's right at the bend of the Wabash River in Grayville, Illinois. Now, essentially what they would do at the button factories, not the finishing plants, but this was where Johann Boppel essentially was involved. Essentially what they would do would be cut blanks. They would cut blanks, and these are examples of the blanks right here. Essentially they would cut them out, and I have an example of a drill. This is one of the drills they would use. Okay, and you can see like this where that fits in there. Look at that, fits perfectly. So you know that this drill here was actually used on this shell, probably either by my grandfather or even my dad, who worked in a button factory in the 1950s. And so here are a few other artifacts that I wanted to show you. Now, this is one of the cool things about being able to record this, is that I can't usually in person bring all of these toys, and I have all of my grandfather's toys. These are examples of some of the saws. They would make their own saws and use files and file them down. You'll notice the saw right there, that's where it comes from, right there. And so this is one of his files, many of them. So now what they would do, this is an example, they would take a pusher in which you would have on one end, they would say, and I'm going to give this to Jennifer, and she's going to show you this as an example. Essentially, that what you see there is called a pusher, and there are some of the tools. The pusher would go into a system, into the saw system on the other side, a really large apparatus that would have coming down onto it what they would call the waterworks. And the pusher would be on one end, you would have the saw on the other end that would be coming through, and this would shoot down, it would actually shoot water down onto the saw. That's why the saws are all rusted, because you have to have water. They didn't have anything to cool them down. This was some of the ideas of Johann Boppel, that he came up with the idea of these button cutting machines. But they were actually perfected to become belt driven and eventually electrically belt driven machines by the Berry family, who were in the area around Muscatine, Iowa. And Muscatine, Iowa is going to become very, very important in the industry, because this is where Johann Boppel actually set up his first shops in the late 1880s, 1890s. And of course, by doing that, this also, in this industry, much like as I talk about automobiles, the feeder industry, you're going to want to have some of the manufacturing nearby as much as possible. This is why button cutting factories, and eventually, for example, like Muscatine, they would also have the finishing shops for the buttons. These were located all on the rivers. Muscatine right along the Mississippi River, and eventually you had other button cutting factories, or just the blank factories, that popped up in other places along the Mississippi, along the Ohio. There's a reason for that. One of the reasons is because within about 10 years' time, the mussel shell population around Muscatine, Iowa had been depleted. So it took, essentially, it was pretty well fortuitous, you might say, for migrant workers who were already used to moving up and down the rivers to go to different areas, because as the mussel shelling industry grew, it became very important, and it was very monetarily lucrative for people. I mean, for example, an average wage worker in the late 1890s might make $4 or $5 a week, but somebody who was a mussel sheller, someone who dug shells, maybe during the night, and maybe cut buttons during the day like my grandfather did, my great uncle did, my great grandfather, other people in the family, you could make around $12 a week digging shells. You could make around $10 a week cutting buttons. So this was 2.5 to 3, almost 4 times what the average wage worker might make during that same time period in the late 1890s and the early part of the 1900s. So this became very important to many people in the migrant industry. Now, like I say, what happened is they had to fan out essentially into other areas because of the populations, of the mussel shelling populations. Many different things were essentially essentially overfishing, you might say, or over digging and dragging the populations, destroyed the populations. The chemicals, essentially from motors, also would destroy the mussel shelling populations in time. And so this is why you essentially see the mussel shelling industry fan out into southern Illinois. It fans out into Tennessee, even into Ohio itself, many different states in the South. But the button finishing would never really leave from Muscatine. This was where all the patents were that would remain. And interestingly enough, Johann Boppel never patented his button cutting machine nor his finishing machine for the buttons. And if it hadn't been for him getting involved with Wildlife and Federal Wildlife and Gaming Commission in the early 1900s, he probably would have actually died completely a pauper, because he didn't think ahead and patent his system. But the Berry family, who had come in, who would also create what they called the Berry double automatic, for what they would do, what was that was for example, was actually creating the holes you would see in buttons, in shells. They created the Berry double automatic. So now I want to finish up just talking about mussel shelling and essentially its effect is that in time, by the 1930s, the mussel shelling industry was already depleting many of the beds for mussel shells around the United States. I mean, there were still areas where mussel shells were very thick, and these were on the southern Wabash River. We had such large and healthy beds along the southern Wabash. Also the White River in Indiana, and even the Little Wabash. These were beds that remained very active even until even in through the 1970s, essentially. But not for the button cutting industry. The button cutting industry itself, as far as people, migrants who worked in the industry, really began to stop by World War II, and World War II would essentially end the pearl button industry as it's known, because of the just absolute massive demand for buttons, for uniforms during World War II. The pearl button industry in early 1900s could produce about 1 billion buttons a year. To be able to it could not maintain that level, especially during World War II. There was no way, when there were probably over 4 billion buttons actually needed, because you have to think of all the buttons on pants, all the buttons on a jacket, all the buttons on shirts. Plastics came in the 1940s and would actually push out the pearl button industry. Did not completely push out the mussel shelling industry, though. Many people actually changed in the 1950s to another industry, even though the pearl button industry, as far as button cutting, was ending by the 1950s. Another industry cropped up in the latter part of the 1950s, and that was the cultured pearl industry. Here's some cultured pearls. Now, cultured pearls that essentially came from oysters. Now, but what oysters? These were South Pacific, near Japan. So what does that have to do with freshwater mussel shell? Here's the reason. What they would do is they would take a freshwater mussel shell. Someone figured this out, that if you take a freshwater mussel shell and grind it down essentially to the size of a pea, much smaller than the size of any pearl, and right here I have an example of pearls, oyster pearls from oysters. If you grind it down to a very, very small bit, if you put that in essentially the tongue of an oyster, it will clamp down on that little freshwater bead from a freshwater pearl, and in time creates a perfectly round pearl, a cultured pearl. So the cultured pearl industry, my grandfather, Chancey Stroughmatt, got involved in that industry. Hundreds of other people who had been involved in that would continue into the 1970s. And that was actually also a very lucrative industry, but one that essentially ended by the 1970s. Well, anyway, I want to stop at that point on mussel shelling, and I just have just a little bit of a thing to talk about, because I like to just talk a little bit about the mussel or the moonshining, because for migrant workers, that's also has a lot to do with migrant workers. In the 1920s, of course, because of Prohibition after World War I, many people who were migrants, like my family, also found another stream of income during that time period. Even though alcohol became illegal in the United States by 1920, millions of gallons of alcohol was produced every year illegally. And migrants, essentially the migrant people who lived along the rivers, actually had some of the best access because they utilized islands along the Ohio River and the Mississippi River to actually do and create moonshine. And it became quite the monetary industry illegally for many people who were migrants. My grandfather and my great uncle in somewhere around 1920 were actually arrested on an island around Columbus, Kentucky, by the local authorities who had come onto the island via a boat. My grandfather often told me the story about how he was thrown into jail in Wickliffe, Kentucky in 1920 for moonshining, and that my great uncle Fred was thrown onto a chain gang for several days. And it's just a little funny story. Essentially, my grandfather, who was around 15 or 16 at the time, didn't have a shirt or shoes. And so he had to spend several nights in jail without a shirt and shoes. And when he finally had his court date, my great-grandfather, Ben Stroughmatt, came to take my grandfather into custody and implored the judge in Wickliffe to let my grandfather go into his custody, and that my great-grandfather would straighten him up and show him the path to righteousness, essentially. And my grandfather said that my great-grandfather bent down to him as he was putting the shirt on to him and says, "Your older brother Fred is fine. He actually escaped from the chain gang and swam the Mississippi River. I'm sorry, the Ohio. He swam the Ohio River back to Cairo. Somebody in a boat picked him up." And actually what he did do is it's kind of a mythological story in the family, but apparently very true, is that actually he used bacon grease to grease his ankle, and was eventually able to get his ankle out of a chain. And then he swam the Ohio River. He was able to get off of one of the chain gang working gangs and swam the Ohio River. I guess he never went back to Kentucky after that. But apparently, like I said, this was it was a very lucrative industry for many people, and they would feed illegal alcohol to many people in the alcohol running business, including in Southern Illinois, a family that was well known called the Shelton family. Another family, or a gentleman named Charlie Berger, in Southern Illinois, and they would essentially, a lot of the migrant workers would feed alcohol to people like this in Southern Illinois. A lot of that alcohol eventually ended up with a guy who was much more famous in Chicago by the name of Al Capone. And so whether or not any of my family's illegal booze ended up there, I don't know, and I don't want to know. So anyway, but anything's possible. But I want to be able to, I don't want to spend all night talking to you folks, because I know we're also going to hopefully have some opportunities for questions later. And so I would like to play a little bit of music for you. See, my great-grandfather, one of the things that my family was involved in was music as well. And they played house dances, barn dances, another stream of income. When you're migrant workers, you find and do whatever you can do. And apparently one of the areas that I guess my great-grandfather got into, he had been a fiddle player, but the fiddle that is in the family, and this is not the fiddle that is in the family, I always keep it upstairs, but the fiddle that I have, we call it the gambler's fiddle, because somewhere around Memphis, Tennessee, in the latter part of the 1890s, my great-grandfather won the fiddle in a card game. And it's what he used at barn dances for the next 3 or 4 decades, essentially. Now, when I learned to play the fiddle, I was given the fiddle, that fiddle by my grandfather. He essentially gave me a choice. He gave me a choice of either having the fiddle, my great-grandfather's fiddle, or they gave me the choice of my great-grandfather's 1898 Browning double, well, it was a 410 double-barreled shotgun. And I said I wanted the fiddle, and so he was going to give the shotgun to my brother. Well, my brother turned down the shotgun too, so I ended up with both of them. So anyway, but it's still a family problem after all these years. But anyway, but when I was given the fiddle, my grandfather asked, he said, you can keep the fiddle as long as you learn to play some songs that your great-grandfather played. And one of them was a song called Turkey in the Straw. So I'll do that for you. Good example that they would have played back in the 1920s, 19-teens, 1920s, and 30s. Straw. So another song that the family would have sung back during that time period, and some of these are songs that I also learned from my great uncles, actually from my grandmother's side, but they were all around during that time in the 1920s and 30s, and they used to have a family band calling themselves the Irish Minstrels, and I have no idea why they called themselves the Irish Minstrels, but they did. And they would even play radio programs in Southern Illinois, and out of Harrisburg, Illinois, as well as even McLeansboro, Illinois, places like this. And one of the songs that they used to do was actually a song that was written by Governor Jimmy Davis, called "You Are My Sunshine." You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. The other night, dear, as I lay sleeping, I dreamed I held you in my arms. And I awoke, dear, and I was dreaming. So I hung my head and I cried. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. Well, our cat Figgy just came in. I don't know if you saw him on the camera or not, but he came running through. So, our kitten Figgy. So anyway, but that's one of the songs that they did. And here's another fiddle song. This is another fiddle tune that my great grandfather apparently used to play, which was a song called Ragtime Amy. This is one that I don't do very often, so hopefully I can get through the song okay. So that's called Ragtime Amy. Well, I'll do one more song here for you, and this is a tune that another one that apparently the family used to do sometime in the late 20s, early 1930s. That my great uncle Othel Othel Goldsmith was his name, that he used to sing this song. The song was called T for Texas, was the name of it. And I also had another great uncle who I never met, unfortunately, by the name of Tavern, Tavern, yes, like a tavern, and was a fiddle player and a dobro player. And he used to play this song on the fiddle, and I've always had to just kind of dream as to how he might have played it on the fiddle. Never knew, but I'll do it for you anyway. And then, like I say, the song's called T for Texas, and actually it was a song that was made famous, written by a guy by the name of Jimmy Rogers. Texas, T for Tennessee, and T for Thelma. That woman made a wreck out of me. And actually, my family spent many a time in Memphis, Tennessee. As I mentioned earlier, they used to dock every winter in Memphis, and so spent a great deal of time and heard early string band music that my grandfather used to talk about, that a lot of people would today call early blues music. This was music that they spent every winter around when they wintered on the Wolf River in Memphis for probably 2 decades. Essentially listening to quite a bit of African American music and essentially living in the exact same place. There was, they basically were, many of the people all living on the river were poor. Whether they were African American, they were white, they all worked with each other, they all worked in the same areas, and even played the same sports, played the same games. So they all played the same music in a lot of ways as well. Well, I want to finish up with one more quick song, and I want to say thanks again. My name's Dennis Stroughmatt, and this was my program on mussel shelling, moonshine, and music. Again, you can find me on the web at creolefiddle.com, and I do have more information about some of the other music and maybe shows that I have going on. If there are any shows going on, you can find out on my website. But I want to finish with a song another song that my great-grandfather used to play. It was something called Old Joe Clark was the name of it. Well, thanks again very much. Appreciate it. Thanks again to the Illinois Humanities Council Rhodes Scholars.
Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed that. I'm sure I did, and you probably did too. We're going to now have Dennis come on live. Dennis, can you?
Hi, can you hear me?
And there you are. Yes, we hear you. And we have some questions for you. Are you ready for those?
Yeah, anytime. I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. The first is, I've heard of water songs that sailors would sing that help time the individuals working together, for example, in raising a sail. Did that same kind of method apply to folks who worked on the longboats on the river?
Well, I know not particularly in my family that anyone talked about. Now, I do know that it doesn't really have, like I say, much to do with my family or my program specifically, but I can tell you that if you go back to like, 2 centuries back, I also do programming on like French Creole music and history. River songs were actually very common amongst like the French Creoles who were along the Mississippi River and the White River, the Wabash River, the Illinois River, the Missouri River. So I know that was very common. My grandfather said occasionally, people whistled or might break out in song a little bit, but nothing specifically about, work songs like while they were working,
Okay. This is a question about the buttons. Were the blanks used for any other purpose when they were discarded after the buttons were cut?
If there was the shells themselves, there's kind of two parts to that. It's because after blanks were cut out of the shells, the discarded shells would actually be used in the place of gravel in a lot of cases. Not really, but not in the Midwest. They usually ship them downriver and they use them for gravel in places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Now, the blanks themselves, what would become the button, there was so little left. What they would do is they would grind those down, actually. Some people would say that I've heard these stories that sometimes ground shell would also be used as chicken feed. I've heard that in a few cases, but I'm not sure that was anything that was necessarily widespread. So hopefully that answers the question somewhat.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Were the saws and their making linked to local economies, or were they made only by the individuals who used them?
Yeah, those weren't mass produced. Those were made by the individuals. Essentially, you were basically given the spring metal to make them, and you had to make your own saws.
Wow, sounds like a labor-intensive industry.
Yeah, there wasn't. I mean, you had major parts of, you had the major machinery, but the actual saws, you had to make them yourselves the same way as I mentioned about the crow's feet, as far as digging for the shells. You had to make those yourselves too and bend your own hooks. So, I mean, it was, people were way more, you might say, self-reliant in that sense. You had to do it. You had to do it on your own.
Okay. Were buttons sold locally, or were they moved elsewhere for sale across the U.S.?
They were moved all over. Essentially, buttons, what it was Muscatine, Iowa became the center for button production. But these buttons were produced and then shipped all over the United States. In fact, all over North America.
Yeah, there's probably a unlimited use for buttons.
Yeah.
Was the Illinois River up near LaSalle also a place where mussels were harvested?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry, I didn't mention that in my program. Many of the rivers, the Illinois River going up in northern Illinois, the Rock River, these were all rivers that had large beds. I mean, wherever you found large, sandbars, fresh water in Illinois, anywhere in the Midwest was, they were, already you knew that was going to be a place where you would find them because they were just common in every freshwater river in the Midwest.
Okay, another question for you. Do you know of any button factories that were along the Illinois?
I know that the Iowa Pearl Button Company had at least 2 factories, small factories. But when you think about a factory could be 20 people working, 10 people working, or it could be as many as 60. So it was never, none of these factories would be like what you think of as today. They weren't. So it's very possible a person could even walk by a building today and never know if it was a small building, may have actually been a button factory. because that's the way it is down here. There were a lot of examples of buildings that, you know, still existed. In some cases still torn down, but yeah, I know, like I say, but to answer again, the Iowa Pearl, and I know they were on the Illinois. I'm not sure about the Elk Pearl. Elk Pearl was another major company. Hawkeye was another one too, and I think Hawkeye might have been somewhere along the Illinois. I'm thinking closer down around Grafton, Illinois. I think there was a Hawkeye company there. So yeah.
Anything? I know you're the historian and the teacher. So any ideas that you could just right off the top of resources that our listeners might want to consult about, you know, the historic buttons? And
Yeah, actually, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources is a really good resource. The Illinois State Museum. Also, there is in Muscatine, Iowa, there is actually I think it might have recently changed names, though. It originally was the Muscatine Pearl Button Museum. It may have changed names though recently, but there actually is a Pearl Button Museum in Muscatine, Iowa, that has a lot of the original button cutting apparatus, as well as some of the finishing machinery that's actually used for cutting, finishing the blanks. So I think those are all really good resources. But like I said, another good start is, like I say, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources is actually a good start, because they've got a lot of information about the different types of shells, they call it clamming. When you go on there, they'll talk about the clamming industry. I never heard that term ever. I didn't hear that term until the last 10 years. And you know, my grandfather never used it, but they'll use that term. But they all have information of history of the industry, examples of different shells, a lot of the different types of names of the shells. They all have that information.
okay, great. We'll get those resources detailed on our website so that people can consult them if they wish. Also, we have a couple more questions. We're not going to keep you all night, but
Okay.
probably would like to. About oyster shells into pearls, the cultured pearls, were they made into rings, necklaces, all kinds of jewelry?
All the above.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I've got rings. Well, they're metal rings, but they're pearl rings, pearls on the rings. Pearl necklaces. I mean, one of the it's interesting because life. I always say art imitates life. Well, life also imitates art. And it's interesting because the pearl button industry, the cultured pearl industry actually owes a lot to Jackie Onassis because there are different covers from Time magazine in the early 60s of her constantly wearing pearl necklaces. And those were cultured pearls. And that's actually part of what and then the movie industry set off this huge, essentially the cultured pearl industry was set off by the movies. But, there became such a desire for them that it literally reinvigorated the whole mussel shelling. As far as working on the river, digging, it reinvigorated the entire industry, for another, I'd say probably 16 years.
Okay, I think just a couple more for you. This is an interesting question. Were you able to tell the difference between the buttons based on where the mussels were harvested? Was there a different look or color?
That one's tough. No, it's really hard to tell that I know. Now, I can almost tell you in some cases the difference, in a few cases I can't. My grandfather absolutely could tell you the different type of shell that a button was from. He could actually tell you based on the sheen of the shell of the button itself that you could actually tell if it were, say, from like a mucket, which has kind of it's almost more of a porous sheen to it, as opposed to maybe like a pig toe or something like that have a darker sheen to the shell. internally. And so, I mean, he would always show me these things just to say, well, you can see what this came from, but those breeds of shells were on every river for the most part. Not all of them, but like, for example, in the Midwest, most of the breeds of shells that you may have found in, say, Grayville, Illinois, were also found in, anywhere around Nashville, Tennessee. They were also would have been found in Springfield, Illinois. Now, maybe shells that you were in Wisconsin might not have had exactly some of the exact same breeds as were in, like, maybe Tennessee and Alabama, So it was, like I say, it was harder to tell if you know where they're actually from, because the breeds are fanned out on so many different rivers.
Okay. And I have a last question for you. Will you be performing anywhere up in the Illinois Valley soon? I know you were just at Cajun Connection in Utica, so if you've got another local, let us know.
Okay, well, I would, the best, I'm trying to think. Right now, the only thing I know that's coming up immediately is actually not going to be in the Illinois Valley, but it's going to be in Arlington Heights. And they're actually going to be doing 2 nights of music, extremely socially distant. I think the venue, it's called the Metropolis Theater in Arlington Heights, and it normally holds about 350 people, and they're going to limit it to 50 people. And I'm doing a small acoustic show just in a duo. And that's going to be the end of next week. So I guess that's the 31st and the 1st. I think I have that right. Either that or the 30th and the 1st. Whatever next Friday and Saturday is, not this coming, but the following week. So after that, it's going to probably be a while again before I'll be back up in the area, but you can always just look on my website. And if you go to the tour page, the calendar page, it's got information of what's coming up.
Okay. Well, Dennis, I just want to thank you again. This was great. I'm glad we got to do it virtually, if not in person. Hopefully, good times next year.
All right. Excellent. Thank you.
And I want to thank our audience for tuning in with us tonight. I want to remind them to please fill out the survey for the Illinois Humanities Council, who sponsored this program. And for information about our upcoming programs that were mentioned earlier, you can consult the LaSalle Public Library's website, Facebook page, or you can email Rachel here at the library at rblumquist, that's B as in boy, L-O, M as in Mary, Q-U-I-S like Sam, T like Tom, at lasalle.lib.il.us. And so we'll conclude tonight. I'll say good night and thank you very much for attending.